Hey there guys, we're going to take a look at our next game. This is actually going to be a look at the matchup with DelverBlue. Now, opening hand is pretty good. We do have 3 lands available to us in the 7 cards. More importantly, 2 of those 3 are basic lands, so they do not come into play tapped, and they do offer us 2 different colors. Now, we're obviously going to start off turn 1 searching out with the Evolving Wilds to find one of the 2 colors that we are missing. Obviously, the best play here, knowing this is one of those hindsight is 20/20 things, knowing this is the mono blue matchup, the DelverBlue matchup, the Fume Spitter is going to be a very important creature, and what you want to do will be Evolving Wilds into a swamp, into the Fume Spitter. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to get that in until turn 2, but the Fume Spitter is a very good creature for this matchup. Now, there's a lot of Pauper decks out there in the competitive environment that will not really be affected by the Fume Spitters. A counter here or there might swing a particular matchup during a combat phase, but really is not going to have a huge impact. That becomes more of an important card in the Infect matchup, and especially in Delver. Now, what this allows us to do is deal with the Delver of Secrets before it gets an opportunity to flip. Once it flips, it's a little bit more troublesome. We still can deal with it with our Burst Lightnings and the like, but the Fume Spitter being able to kill that off before it flips is very important as well. So, I did not know right off the bat here. My opponent does start with Preordain, which is something that you can see in Delver, or you can see in Izzet Post. Now, I did not. I will call this a misplay. Okay, we'll say this. It was a misplay. Usually you want to wait until the end of your opponent's turn. You see I used Evolving Wilds in the middle of his draw step for some random reason. Now, had I waited until the end of his turn, I would have seen the second island going down and think, okay, maybe this is Delver and maybe I should get a swamp instead. But I was impatient. I immediately sacrificed the Evolving Wilds to get the mountain, which is usually the right place so you have something open for Burst Lightning in the early game. Unfortunately for me, my opponent is playing Delver, and what I wanted was the Fume Spitter. You see I draw into a second one, which is great. Like I said, they're very good for this matchup, but not having the black land available to me does not let me get it into play. Now, opponent does get a Delver of Secrets down. I have an opportunity here. I am going to start out putting out the Skyfisher, trying to draw out the counterspell because my opponent, you see, had 2 untapped lands. I did leave the swamp available, so if I did get that counterspell, then I would be able to get the Fume Spitter into play and still kill off the Delver of Secrets. He uses Gush, actually, which says that he does not have the counterspell. The Skyfisher does land and will stay on the field. I am going to return the Prism so I can get extra draw later on. This is something that your opponent is, especially in this deck, not likely to... Sorry about that, it's my phone. Not likely to counterspell. Because of the fact that it's just so janky and random. Now, if you were playing the Izzet Post deck, then that might be something they might consider, but it's really something that is going to be able to slip by and allow you to draw cards. Especially at this point in time when we're already sitting on our 4 different color sources, it's not so critical if he does decide to waste a counterspell on it. I'm okay with that. So as you see, I use the black mana, I get the Fume Spitter in, and I kill off the Delver before it has an opportunity to flip. He does use Snap in order to return the Skyfisher to my hand, and I'm okay with that because it will give me an opportunity on the next turn. Probes there. On the next turn, I can both put down the Prism and get the Skyfisher back into play. So we're going to tap out appropriately here, which I didn't. Doesn't really matter because the Prism will come down uncountered, draw a card, and get to replay. Oh, I don't make the play. I'm sorry. I apologize. I would have had an opportunity there to replay the Skyfisher. I guess what I was thinking here is that getting the Fume Spitter in is more important at this point in time. Getting that down when my opponent does not have counterspells is definitely important, but I think maybe the Skyfisher would have been a better play there, so I can get that damage going early. Now, he does put down another Delver, which is an interesting play, and it even gets more interesting as he attempts to snap the Fume Spitter. So, in response, I am obviously going to sacrifice that to kill the Delver. Definitely a very, very bad move on my opponent's part. I don't know what he was thinking. Because of the fact that he targeted the Fume Spitter, I obviously am going to sacrifice that in response. It is going to cancel the snap, which means he does not get to untap lands. Like I said, I don't know what he was thinking about there. If he was just trying to get rid of the Fume Spitter, he should have realized at the very least that I was going to use it anyways on the Delver. But we are going to get the opportunity. Now we are going to put the Skyfisher back into play, return the Prism, and put it back. Which is very important. I totally just missed a land drop in that phase too. Wow, this was not my best game. Now that I look at it, I didn't even realize while playing that I missed a land drop there. Oh well. Opponent does get the Delver down, so now I am starting to think that maybe he was trying to force me to use the Fume Spitter, but at the same time, like I said, that is something that I was going to do anyways, and I didn't really need the snap as motivation to kill it. So going to swing through with the Skyfisher. I am going to attempt to kill the Delver of Secrets, and at the very least draw out the counterspell. Interesting play here, he puts down a Spell Stutter Sprite, which is going to counter the 1 casting cost because it is the 1 in play, so in response I am going to use the Prism and cast a Lightning Bolt to kill off the Sprite. This means that when this trigger on the stack here, when this trigger resolves, it counts the number of fairies, and there are currently 0 fairies on the field, which means that it does not counter my Burst Lightning, and it will counter the Delver of Secrets. Now I finally make my land drop. I see a pretty interesting draw. All of these things are going to be good for me, so we're going to just put them back in order. Get an opportunity now to put the second Skyfisher down and get the Prism because my opponent is tapped out. Definitely a situation you want to be in, because usually, I mean, they do occasionally run the snaps and the Vapor Snags, but once a creature manages to get on the field, it tends to stay. And we have said several times that the Skyfisher is kind of the biggest, beefiest creature that we have, so getting those on the field and sticking is very important. Opponent's not getting a great draw here. He is at 3 cards, which puts me at an advantage. I am going to attack first, just to see if I can draw out any kind of snaps or Vapor Snags on these guys before I make my plays. None of that happens, so we're going to put the Prism into play. Drawing into the Squadron Hawk here, but because there was nothing else, I am going to attempt to put out the Seagate Oracle. He does decide to mana leak that, and that's fine. You could have put out the Muldrifter at that point in time, but again, assuming that he has counterspells available with that much mana untapped. So, makes no other play, going to attack now. Now we're in a kind of an interesting position here. I think one of the strongest cards in this matchup is the Gravedigger. You definitely, if you have Grave Recursion, it is a very strong thing to have against DelverBlue. I just want to talk for a second. DelverBlue is a very strong thing. They can counter your threats, but if you can do 2 things, you can still win this match. The first thing is to keep their threats under control. Several decks these days are not running the Drakes anymore, so their creatures are in range for all of the burn spells that you have as your main creature destruction in this deck. Delver of Secrets can be dealt with the Fume Spitters before the Lightning Bolts and whatnot. You have a lot of options for killing those off. And the second thing, if you can keep threats coming. Now, by that I mean, Core Skyfisher is a threat. Having 2 of them, it's a threat, so he wants to counter either of these. Now, countering things like the Oracle, also important. Countering the Muldrifters, very important. So you have all of these important creatures that he's going to want to stop. At the same time, he's going to be wanting to use those counterspells to save his own creatures. So you're basically forcing him to counter a whole bunch of things. And that's usually okay for this matchup because your creatures are dead, but at the same time, our deck gets an advantage by running these 2 Gravediggers. That means, okay, he's just used a counterspell to stop my Oracle from coming into play. Now I have an opportunity. I can tap out here, play the Gravedigger, and he has to counter this. If he does not counter this, not only do I have a 2/2 body on the field, but I am getting back the Oracle, and it is another thing that he wants to counter. So it's giving me additional threats that he needs to counterspell. The Gravedigger is a creature that, if it was just a generic 2/2, he might not counter it, but because of the fact that it is going to get me the Oracle back, it makes it that much stronger and that much more of a threat to my opponent. He really wants that to die. If he does not, I'm going to get another creature back. I'm going to have a body on the field. It's going to be definitely trouble for him. It just adds more pressure to him because of the fact that I have Grave Recursion. This is something that things like Teachings and Dimir Post have gained advantage with because of the fact that they get that recursion. Decks like the Green-White Tokens, it's a totally janky rogue deck, but it gets a big advantage against Mono-Blue control and against the Delver control. UB Trinket, Dimir Trinket, that deck, it gets a pretty decent game against blue control because it gets so many threats. You want to counter the Trinket mages because they fetch more. Bone Splitters, Life Staffs, you don't want those on the field. The Fume Spitters, again, very good for this matchup. So there's a lot of things that it forces Mono Blue to want to counter. And like I said, I did an analysis of Mono Blue when I split Delver from Mono Blue control. And the one thing that you realize is even though it feels like very heavy control, they're actually not running that many counter spells. Maybe 10 to 11. is pretty typical. So having more than 10 or 11 threats is something that's going to give you an advantage. Not only that, but that's 10 or 11 cards spread out through 60. They're going to have a 1 in 6 chance of drawing one of those counterspells. So their odds of getting all 10 in a game is pretty low. So if you can put out 10 threats in a game, your odds of getting one of those threats to stick is better than their odds of drawing 10 counterspells. Hopefully that made sense, but what I'm just basically trying to say is that we can get an advantage because of these Gravediggers. Having all these threats that come into play, I mean, the Squadron Hawk, it's why Mono White has been a little bit more aggressive recently. That's something that is also very important, because if they let one of those Squadron Hawks go through, I'm immediately going to have 3 more in my hand that are going to be coming down. So sure, you let one come into play, but there's still more coming in behind it. So that first one, I really don't want it to stick every time because I don't want those others showing up. So we're going to attack through here, putting my opponent down to 4 life, just out of lightning bolt range, but I will be able to attack through on my next turn for the win. I am going to put out the other Gravedigger here. This is something, again, he is going to be forced to counterspell. If he has a counterspell, he's going to have to counter it, which he does. So now he is put down to 2 cards in hand. One of those is an island, which he is going to be able to replay. Now makes kind of an interesting move here, puts down the Spellstutter Sprite, and obviously this is something that is going to be a desperation attempt to chump block one of the Skyfishers, give him yet another turn to try and hopefully find something. Honestly, he's not going to be able to, unless he has an answer in this one card in his hand. Whatever he top decks will not be able to save him from 2 creatures. Even worse for him, I do have the Lightning Bolt available to me. So on my turn here, I am going to attempt to Lightning Bolt the Skyfisher, Lightning Bolt the Spellstutter Sprite to give my Skyfishers a clear path to attack. He does have a counterspell to stop that. That's okay because we still have Doomblade in hand. He did probe a couple of turns back, so he is aware of the fact that I had these cards and knows the game is over, but is playing it out. So I am going to tap out to kill the Spellstutter Sprite, leaving me a clear pathway to attack for that final 4 with no cards in my opponent's hand. So, what do I think of this matchup? Well, obviously come the time for sideboarding, maybe you want to bring an Echoing Decay to deal with the sprites and the Cloud of Fairies if you ran into a lot of problems with those. Negate is something that could definitely gain you an advantage here. But I really think this deck actually is a little bit favorable against DelverBlue. DelverBlue, while it's a control deck, is actually pretty close to aggro as well. They're usually running at least 20 creatures. I had talked about this at length, and it's kind of an interesting thing, and one of the reasons why I split it. Having all those creatures really puts it in a boundary between aggro control. We have a lot of kill spells for those creatures, a lot of stuff in our range. The Fume Spitters are actually useful against this, and like I said in just a couple minutes ago, the fact that we have the ability to put out so many threats, there are so many things here that your opponent is going to want to counter. Unless he is a very experienced DelverBlue player, he's not necessarily going to know what he should be countering and what he should be letting go through. Even if he does decide to counter every single threat that you drop, enough time is going to be able to pass that you can kind of pull things out. The Crossroads are going to help you gain that extra that extra life up to keep yourself in a pretty good range. You see here, I did not take a single point of damage because of the fact that I had so many kill spells available to me. I had 2 Fume Spitters, I had Lightning Bolts, Burst Lightning, Doomblade, and he was able to counter a lot of creatures, but as soon as I could get these Skyfishers to stick, that was my real key to victory here. Now, while I do think it is slightly favorable, it does come down to a couple of extra components that could affect this. One of those would be the ability of your opponent. My opponent here did make a couple of misplays. A very experienced Delver player might not make so many of those. At the same time, you have to be very aware of your opponent's open mana base. You have to be very aware also of what he has in his hand as far as how many cards. Using cards that are more important when he is tapped out, like Compulsive Research, I would wait until he had an opportunity, wait till I had an opportunity to play this without worrying about a counterspell. This is where you have to be smart about throwing in bluffs, throwing out a spell, like a Skyfisher to try and eat up, or a Blightning, try and eat up those counterspells where you can, and then get the more important spell in behind it when you know your opponent is tapped out and you have an opportunity.